Hello, and welcome to the Product Launch Do's and Don'ts podcast, another exciting episode in our Product Launch series. Hear from Lynn Donaldson, recognized for having great success working with product launch teams in the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry, as well as her all-star cast of experts in their industry, as they come together to answer your questions and outline how to have a successful product launch. Listen to Lynn and the experts share their knowledge and expertise from their real-life examples to ensure your success. So if this is your first product launch, or if you've launched products in the past, you're sure to find great value.
Welcome, I'm Lynn Donaldson from Connect Strategic Solutions Group. Our focus is on helping mid-sized pharmaceutical and medical device companies to launch valuable products for their patients so that their treatment choices and needs can be met. Over the next couple of months, we will interview experts from various functions that will be integral to the launch of these valuable products. Ultimately, benchmarking is our end goal, how we define and achieve success. The objectives for the interviews are: 1, to discover what drives a successful product launch from our experts, provide podcast participants, the next generation or the current generation, with material that will trigger ideas, and identify potential innovations to advance the industry as a whole. We will not share proprietary information. We will speak in generalities based on our experience. Our March podcast features a guest who brings a different perspective to product launch and is an expert in pharmaceutical medical affairs. Ben has been in the life science industry for 9 years and has led companies through the launch process with great success. Ben's experience outside the life science industry also includes academia, clinical, public health, and regulatory. So Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. And since we've collaborated in the past, I'm looking forward to hearing your insights into the launch of a new product. So let's get started with the questions. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Are you in the pharmaceutical or medical devices industry?
Hello, Lynn. Thanks for having me. This is very exciting. I think it's a great opportunity to have other people listen and learn and hopefully take a tidbit or two about life sciences and also launching innovative products. I'm currently in between industry roles. I'm transitioning from one pharma organization to another, and I've been in industry after my academic public health, clinical, and regulatory experiences for the past 9 years now. So I'm looking forward to the next journey in this road.
Perfect. Thank you. Why did you join the industry from your previous academia and public health experience?
It was an interesting path to industry. Many of us who pursue medicine are really driven by the individualized patient care or group of patients in our respective communities that we take care of. I'm a board certified pediatrician by training. So certainly seeing children develop from out of the womb and into college, so to speak, is very exciting, and helping them be healthy members of our society and productive adults. I'd always been interested in research even before I went to medical school. During my undergraduate years and pre-medical school years, I had always had the research itch. And I'd done some of that in my academic training and academic practice as well, and really didn't have too much connection with industry folks other than, the sales reps who would come to the clinics and in the office. And it was really an opportunity after speaking with a couple of friends of mine who had transitioned into industry, a couple of folks older than I am, and also a close family friend of ours who is in the industry, but not as a scientist, more as a legal regulatory expert, and said, hey, this would be an ideal opportunity for you to consider research in the same way you'd done it before, just on a much larger scale. For me, research had always been, a few patients, a couple of hundred, not to the level that ultimately I've been able to do it since. So it was certainly an opportunity to expand my reach with the expertise and the excitement that I've had about continuing research. So certainly not into the hundreds of patients, but certainly into the thousands and tens of thousands with some of the products that I've worked on in the past few years.
Well, thank you for your contributions. I mean, it's tremendous to hear that you're actually able to help more people through more research. What current function or department do you serve, or when you're in the industry, what role do you normally serve?
So I'd always been in medical affairs. I had started and in my last role had been medical director, and I'd had escalating responsibilities, I guess, from what you would consider a first to industry novice, more junior type medical director to really understand sort of like the dynamics between the different functions in the organization. And I always stayed in medical affairs. I had been in organizations where I had been the leader of a therapeutic area in medical affairs, being the accountable therapeutic area head medical director at my most recent organization. And it really gave me the opportunity to build a team, some of them from the ground up, like my most recent position, bringing different cross-functional partners, not just in medical affairs, but in clinical development and commercialization as well, to develop a cohesive team. So I've always been a medical director in medical affairs.
Thank you. And just for anybody who doesn't really know what the role entails, can you give us a little bit of information about what you do on a day-to-day basis, or what the role actually entails?
Sure. It sounds a little bit like a conductor of an orchestra in some respects, because as the accountable medical affairs leader, I had to bring together a variety of different cross-functional partners to meet the strategic goals and the vision of the therapeutic area and any products that were in that therapeutic area. So, for example, putting together a team of our headquarter medical directors, of which I had a few under my direction, other cross-functional partners like health economics and outcomes research, biostatistics, field medical, which are kind of like our eyes and ears away from headquarters out in the local geographies where they engage with local clinicians in their respective geographies. Folks like patient advocacy, other professionals like our colleagues in medical education and scientific communication and publication. So bringing all of these people together to tell the coherent story of both the therapeutic area, and if there are products within that therapeutic area, either under development or currently approved, to look at data, to look at real world data, to potentially develop phase 4 or long-term observational studies in the therapeutic area to better understand not just the unmet need that remains, but also look at the real world effectiveness of whatever approved therapy was being used for the indication that was being used for.
It's quite a complicated job then, really. And like you say, orchestrating all of these moving parts is quite a task.
Yeah, I mean, the luxury there is that fortunately we were all rowing the boat in the same direction. And part of my job was making sure that, just everyone was rowing with the same cadence. Not everyone needed to be doing each other's work, but certainly as the medical lead for the program, and I've done this in a couple of organizations, it was my job essentially to kind of know what everyone else is doing and make sure that we were all connected in one way or another to ensure successful execution of the strategy at hand.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, like you say, that kind of brings me on to the next question with how do you define a successful product launch based on bringing all of those people together and getting everything to work and rowing in the same direction? But how do you define successful product launch?
Yeah, I think one of the most important parts is the timing of when product launch begins. And I don't want to make it seem that product launch activities begin sort of like, a week or two before the actual decision from the FDA. Ideally, it would happen at the onset of the phase 3 clinical trial, because at that point, there are so many factors that need to be coordinated. Certainly the clinical development team that's running the phase 3 trial, but even before then, when it comes to the development of the protocol, is ensuring that the medical affairs team and the other cross-functional partners who make up that team have input into the development of the protocol to make sure that all the endpoints that are selected not only are valuable from a health and science perspective, but that they meet regulatory parameters, that they actually meet real world needs. Some of these endpoints are fascinating to study, but may have no impact on clinical practice and may actually be a barrier for clinicians to actually use a therapy. So it's making sure that, all of these different parts on the clinical side are merged together, but also to integrate the commercialization side of the business as well, right? What matters to the business? And I do think that when we think about product launch, not only do we have to think about the scientific and clinical benefit, but we have to think about it as a business need as well, right? What we're, we are for-profit entities, right? So we do want to be able to commercialize and market and sell the product in the healthcare community. So it's really making sure that you start early enough. And one of the challenges about starting early enough is, are there resources to start early enough? That's probably one of the things that I've seen over my years of working in big and small organizations is that either there is cash in the wallet or there isn't as much cash in the wallet to really make some of these activities move forward. So it's important to know where the organization lives in a financial sense, because some of those decisions as to how much to invest ahead of product launch may be either financial in nature or philosophical in nature, or it could be demanded by a regulatory organization. So it does depend. But nevertheless, I do think that starting as early as possible to take into account what are the regulatory needs, what are the market needs, what are the clinician needs, how many other competitors exist out there. I think that's another aspect of having a successful launch is differentiating your product from others. And certainly one could argue they should be at the beginning and at the end of this conversation are the patients, right? What do the patients need so that the product can be designed and investigated appropriately, and then double back with the same patients and say, this is what we came up with. What do you think? Is this what you wanted? Because they are the most important audience, in my opinion, for a successful launch.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Making sure that the patient gets what they need or what they want, because as you say, competitors can be giving them certain things. And when you're looking to see if there's an unmet need that still hasn't been fulfilled, it's the patient you go to. So thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. And back to your comment about resourcing, we've worked with small and mid-size and large pharma companies. And yes, it can be sometimes down to resourcing as well, depending on, whether you as a medical team have to wear multiple hats because you haven't necessarily got the resources, or you have a lot of resources. And so there are a lot of important points in there. Thank you. I mean, I've just picked on a couple of them, but thank you very much. Can you possibly give an example of a product launch that you would consider successful?
Yeah, sure. I've been fortunate to have been in organizations that have had a number of successful launches in the immunology, dermatology, allergy, respiratory, and even pediatric spaces, both in large and small companies. One in particular, without naming names, brings to mind a landscape change in the treatment of a dermatological condition. And I'm going back about 7-8 years ago, where the belief was that this condition was uniformly treated by the dermatology community. And in reality, it was the allergy immunology community that took care of the majority of these patients because of a complex dermatological manifestation of what is still, in essence, an unknown reason for why this dermatological condition occurs. One of the challenges from a scientific perspective is that we in the scientific community have yet to really clarify how this disease really manifests itself. What's the mechanism by which the dermatological manifestation of this disease presents itself? But one of the successful aspects of that launch was engaging with the dermatology community fairly early in the development and realizing halfway through that a lot of dermatologists would send those patients to the allergist because they were confounded. It wasn't straightforward. It wasn't a condition that was always there. I'll pick on one and I'll be specific about one condition like psoriasis. It's not the disease regarding this specific launch, but in psoriasis, you see it all the time, right? And when it's better, it's gone. And when it's not better, it comes back, right? So it's pretty visible, but this other condition kind of comes and goes, and no rhyme or reason, and nothing has really been identified in the mechanism of disease. So a lot of dermatologists would send those patients off to either a rheumatologist or an allergist, and it was the allergist who kind of figured out what was happening. Not that they understood the mechanism of what was happening. They just understood the condition better than the dermatologist. And once the organization figured that out, it was a nice pivot to be able to engage two different groups of medical experts to really ensure not only that the disease area was properly communicated to both groups of clinicians, but that these therapies, and the first one that was launched in this indication, 7-8 years ago, that I was part of the launch team, provided some insight as to treatment, and to this day continues to be the leading treatment for this dermatological condition. So I think it comes down to making sure that the organization has a plan, but also has the ability to pivot when need be and not have blinders on to be completely unaware of the changing landscape. And in this case, the changing landscape was within the treating healthcare provider community.
Yeah, I get your point in terms of who should sit around the table when you're having these discussions and getting their input. Because as you saw, the allergist as well as the dermatologist were very much involved with the discussion, and getting people in a room as well as separately was probably very valuable to understanding. But as you said, being able to pivot and move with the insights that were coming through from your discussions or your team's discussions with the healthcare professionals, you were starting to understand a little bit more. And so you were able to adapt and move with that. So utilizing the insights effectively. Great job.
Yeah, it was interesting also because there was no competitor landscape, so one of the aspects that made it successful, yet at the same time could make it challenging, is that we didn't have a comparator entity to say, okay, this is how they did it. At that point, we were leading the charge. So when we made the decision to launch using a certain philosophy and a certain approach, it certainly was because we could pivot and engage multiple healthcare providers and all of their insights for success. And that's been still the case. Many of these experts who I see on a regular basis, they're sort of like, hey, Ben, you remember when blah, blah, blah. And it's still what we use, right? So it's like, okay, I totally understand that. And they remind us that the best part of what we did was making sure that we can have all the people, all the right HCPs around the table to make sure that we had as many stones uncovered, knowing that not every stone could be uncovered.
That's awesome. And the product's still doing well, I'm sure. And it was being first in class is always an interesting risk, but reward. If you're first in class or first, like you said, there were no competitors, no real competitors to benchmark against, but that's an awesome way to go. And clearly patients are benefiting. And that's at the end of the day, as we've said, what we're all here for is patients benefiting.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the nice things there is because it's benefited so many people, not just in the US, but around the world, we've had the opportunity to engage with some of those patients as well. And not only are they thankful and grateful, but also give us the opportunity to really learn more from them, because I do think that it gives us an opportunity, especially through our patient advocacy partnership, to continue to learn. Just because the product is launched doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. There's still so much to learn afterwards.
Yeah. And as you said, sometimes it might be a phase 4 design, trial design, to maybe hone in a little bit closer to the particular patients that it can help. Everybody's looking at targeted therapies, but is there a particular patient that we can help more than somebody else that we can really know when we give you this product, it's going to help you? Perfect. Thank you. So let's talk about perhaps some challenges to a successful product launch. Have you seen different challenges? I mean, you've just talked about a really successful launch, but there's the other side where there's sometimes challenges.
Sure. And I've seen those as well in different organizations. There's no one factor that really influences whether it's a successful or a challenge in product launch. Sometimes the size of the organization is the challenge, especially if the size of the organization doesn't have experience in the therapeutic area that they're launching in. Sometimes it's a difference between the type of organization, if it's a pharmaceutical organization versus a biotech organization. And even though the biotechs tend to be a lot more nimble and innovative, unless they've done it before, sometimes they get ahead of themselves and don't take into account many of the regulatory factors or even patient-centric factors. It's really about hitting the endpoint, getting a p-value, hopefully convincing the regulatory authority, and then moving on. Another challenge is whether the organization is doing it alone or do they have a partner. And I've worked in organizations where products have been successfully and unsuccessfully been launched, whether they were alone, in a partnership, and every mixture in between, whether it's a partnership from a commercialization perspective or a development perspective or a manufacturing perspective. So there are different types of partnerships and alliances between organizations, and there are too many to enumerate here, and those are easy enough to find on if you have a moment just to research, sort of like company partnerships. And then there are also challenges within specific therapeutic areas. Now, some therapeutic areas might be perceived to be easier than others because there are still unmet needs. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, asthma, COPD, all still have many patients, and those are among the leading causes of morbidity and mortality in the US and around the world. So it does depend on the therapeutic area, and other challenges may be a brand new therapeutic area, like it's a rare disease that's trying to be addressed. And there have been recent scientifically revolutionary products developed in rare diseases, but challenges to a successful product launch, namely because no one really knows what the condition is because it's so rare, or two, what the product does, and three, getting it paid for. Frankly, whether it's the insurance companies, whether it's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, like here in the United States, these become much more challenging issues that have to be addressed way before product launch. I mean, these are discussions that have to happen years in advance to really, as some in the pharma industry may use this phrase, quote unquote, prepare the market. And preparing the market is a complex, it sounds simple, but it's a very complex endeavor because you have to take into account what the patients need, what the doctors want, what the payers are going to put forward, what is the government going to say. All of those are really challenging issues. So it's hard to say that there are 1, 2, or 10, challenges to successful product launch, because many times they may be specific to either the individual company or the therapeutic area or the broader healthcare financing system, right? If I take those three examples. But that doesn't mean that the organizations shouldn't go forward. I mean, everybody has to push forward and try to get through those. And that's where experience comes into play as well. And frankly, I do think that's where partnerships sometimes helps, because there may be larger organizations who have successfully achieved those product launches, and partnering with one of those groups will allow for a smaller organization to get their product out on the market.
Yeah, I totally agree. If you were to define a suboptimal launch, what would it look like to you? And it's not necessarily a failure, but it's not as optimal as expected. It doesn't reach the patients that it needs to reach, for example.
Yeah. And suboptimal launches, have become successful over time or have become failures over time. And there may be individual specific factors. A couple that I've seen throughout the years comes down to a division of labor as to like who's leading the effort of product launch, whether it's the clinical development team or the commercialization team, but not both of them together. And that may also be a function of the organizational structure. In my experience and in also my observations and conversations with colleagues who work in big and small organizations alike, I think it comes down to the fundamental philosophy of the organization. Is science going to lead the launch, or is commercial going to lead the launch? And there are times where if they're not on the same page, it can get messy. And that's where I mentioned before, as I dovetail back to what makes a successful launch, is to have all of those people at the room around the table at the beginning. One would argue at the beginning of the development of the phase 3 protocol, but certainly by first patient, first visit of the phase 3 study. Because at that point, there are clear lanes of demarcation where we could see each other. And I say we because I generally consider myself more on the clinical side, clinical medical side than in the commercial side. But one of the balances that we have to take into account is who's going to be able to deliver messages and discussions between different groups in the organization. That's where I think medical affairs is like very optimally positioned. And I've had years of experience in this situation where the clinical people have never really engaged with the commercial folks and don't even know who to talk to. And we talk to them all the time in medical affairs and vice versa. The commercial folks want to know who the clinical development folks are, but they've never engaged with them because they're the scientists, quote unquote. So why would a commercial folk, engage with the scientists? So I think it's a balance of this approach in communications and in sharing of information. And a lot of times where it's suboptimal, it's when those connections are delayed in the process. So ideally, a successful launch, those conversations and plans start early. In a challenging launch, maybe those conversations even don't happen. And suboptimal is kind of like somewhere in between, and you kind of get there, but it just takes a little bit longer than anticipated. And then there may be some other third-party factors that get in the way to suboptimal launches. Sometimes there are patent issues between companies. Let's say there's a competitor in the same therapeutic area, and they have a patent on the technology that the new company doesn't account for, or maybe chooses not to account for at their own risk. And then that's when lawsuits come into play, and then, the courts get involved and all the lawyers. And I'm married to a lawyer, but I think even she would admit that too many lawyers are a bad thing. So those are like red herrings and sort of like very strange situations that can really impact product launch over time, because then as those complexities become more and more exposed, that only delays even more the timing for a successful launch.
Yeah, and the delays can cause a big impact. Just 6 to 8 months by having a delay from one of those issues or challenges, shall we say, can make a big difference to the number of patients that can receive it. Because as you say, the market's changing all the time, the landscape's changing, and the payers may have wanted the product previously, but then a competitor's come out. So, it can have a big impact.
That's correct. And then the patients suffer at the end, right? Especially when they're waiting for this innovative therapy that they were expecting, and especially if they were participants in the clinical trials and had a perceived benefit. They may not have known which treatment arm they were in because it was a randomized blinded study, but they still want to have access to those therapies. So any of these delays in timing, again, helps define what a suboptimal launch is, because not all of the factors were taken into account.
Yeah, and back to your point about the integration, medical affairs are kind of the bridge, aren't they, between commercial and clinical?
We do think so. We do think that we are keenly positioned to be able to have the scientific discussions with the clinical folks in the same way that we can have a commercialization discussion with the marketing folks. For us, we are able to bridge that gap between them because we work equally well in both venues.
Yeah, and I've seen you personally in your role, and I know that's exactly what you do, and your teams that have worked under you. If you're talking about success, what metrics do you think you would use for success of a product? What would make it a success for you? What does good look like?
Beyond what the commercial do, because I think those metrics are different. The metrics for medical and for medical affairs has always been a relatively controversial topic, right? Because medical and clinical, we don't sell anything. We don't have to chase doctors down to see how many prescriptions they write, and revenue is defined and collected differently for the clinical and medical team. Although the clinical team could say, well, we got our phase 3 study approved, and now we have a stamp from the FDA or another health authority, and that's our metric. But medical affairs, I think, is a lot softer. So we tend to use metrics like engagements with investigators and healthcare providers and key opinion leaders in the therapeutic area, not just about the studies that are being done, but understanding how to communicate the science of how the therapy works in a much more broader sense to the healthcare provider community. And I use healthcare provider broadly because it could be physicians, it could be nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, nurse educators, anyone who engages with a patient in a specific therapeutic area, should understand not just how our therapy works, but any therapy in their therapeutic area works, right? So how do we get the science out to them? And frankly, how many of those clinicians engage with us regarding that science? So we have an opportunity not just on one-on-one and in small groups, but also how many of them attend our Congress sessions? If we have a disease state presentation or a medical education activity, whether it's for CME credits or not, we can, quote unquote, take attendance. So how many people actually engage? And one of the ways we've been able to measure more of that, frankly, as we get to the next stage of whatever this COVID pandemic/epidemic becomes, is digital education. So using virtual platforms, using different vehicles to engage with clinicians, whether through their IP addresses or formal registrations, to learn more, not just about our products, but also learn about the science behind the mechanism of disease and the mechanism of action for these comparable therapies. So we try to engage that way more with clinicians to try to get a better metric to track over time. We tend to do this a lot more on the medical side because the commercial side, for a variety of compliance reasons, can't really do anything until the product is approved. So we have the luxury on the pre-approval side to engage with many clinicians, but the commercial side, not as much. They have some engagement, but not at the level that we do in medical affairs. Certainly another area from a pre-approval perspective that would be helpful, especially in a highly competitive therapeutic area, think like asthma or COPD, is how big the sales team and the marketing team is going to be, right? So there are companies out there that track how many job postings there are there, how big a current team looks like, so we do have the opportunity to then benchmark ourselves in relation to others and potentially identify how big our team is going to be, right? So all of that goes into how we measure some of those metrics for success, or at least for comparison. And certainly from a commercialization perspective, I hope you'll have someone participate in this podcast series from the commercial side, because it'd be great for them to give their perspective on how they measure that differently than we do in medical affairs.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've worked with companies as we work with our clients pre-launch, like yourselves and in the medical affairs team, has been this discussion around metrics and what good looks like and what the metrics can be, because it is one of those sort of intangible things whereby, yes, you can measure the number of people you speak to, but is it the quality of the conversation? Do they really understand the mechanism of action that you're trying to impart the knowledge on? Or do they still have questions? Do they understand how the different mechanisms of action within a body can actually affect that patient? So can there be synergies, or are there things that you mustn't put with one another because there'll be interactions? So we've had those situations with many of our clients when they're saying, well, we need KPIs, because if you don't measure it, you don't know it's happening. So you always have to have KPIs. But I know some teams struggle when they come to what are our KPIs. I've worked on the launch side of it, the sales side of it as well. And we had very clear KPIs, of course. But from the medical affairs side, it's a little bit different, like you said. And you've mentioned before some of the functions that you think are a priority for successful launch. And you mentioned, that really it's getting people around the table. Are there other functions that you think that need to be involved? So you've talked about clinical, medical, and your commercial all sitting around the table. Are there other functions you think need to be around the table?
Certainly, and especially in therapeutic areas where there are not too many approved therapies, usually and this kind of falls within the health economics and outcomes research group, what they tend to do, and I'm always impressed by the work that they do, is try to understand where unmedical needs are in that therapeutic area. What is it that the patients want? How is it that the clinicians prescribe what they have? Many times they tend to use therapies that are off-label for their indication, but it kind of works, right? So my experience with the HEOR team, as we call them, Health Economics and Outcomes Research, does a lot of planning in understanding the therapeutic area space better than others on our team. And what they tend to use is a lot of real world data to their advantage. So they are very strong in seeing the epidemiology of disease, the progression of changes in the therapeutic areas over time, and try to understand and try to forecast what will happen in the future. Certainly, if the clinical development team doesn't have a successful phase 3 program, it actually doesn't matter whether you're going to have a successful launch or not, because if the phase 3 study fails, it's not going to get approved, and that's that, right? So they are probably, if they're not the first domino, they are one of the first ones. But that doesn't mean that we in medical affairs or even our commercialization partners don't have input into ensuring that we can prepare for a successful launch very, very early on in the development and execution of the study. Our regulatory partners are divided, I think, very ingeniously between clinical, medical, and commercialization. And they play an interesting role because certainly there's a regulatory team with the clinical trial that wants to make sure that they're meeting all the needs of the health authorities. But then there's also regulatory affairs professionals who keep an eye on another part of the health authority group, which is the advertising and promotion side, which is how do we market said approved product, and what is it that we can say and how we can say it. So those conversations are actually very interesting and certainly keenly important for a successful launch as well, because we want to be able to put the right scientific and marketing messages to the public as soon as possible, either simultaneously or even just before launch, to ensure that we've quote unquote prepared the market, that phrase that I've mentioned before. Another group that I kind of mentioned them tangentially, but very, very important as well, is what we call our payer team. They are the ones who really go to talk to the insurance company medical directors. They talk to the public payer system. I'm used to it both in the US, but there are many countries around the world where they just speak directly with the government leaders and essentially say, here's what we're trying to solve for. Here's our trial. What do you all think? Do these endpoints make sense? Your competitors in the space have used the same ones and they are reimbursed at this level. Do you anticipate reimbursement being comparable? And they kind of straddle both the medical and business side of it. So I think they are a very important group, our payer specialists within pharma, to understand the strong dynamics in healthcare financing. And for certain large countries and for very, very small countries, ridiculously important because they have such a big chunk of their budget. Those are some of the groups that I consider to be, highly prioritized for a successful launch as well.
And like you say, the HEOR teams will know the patient journey and they'll look at what phase each patient comes in. But then your regulatory, from the point of view of what's in the label. We worked with a company whereby we were working very closely on, we looked at the phase 3 trial and what should be in it. But we were working very closely with the regulatory team to determine, right, this is what we want to be able to say. What does that endpoint look like? And can we get it? Do we think that's what has to go in? So what does have to go into the label? Because, of course, in the US, you cannot promote anything that's off-label. So if it doesn't say it in the label, you can't say it. And so we were trying to kind of negotiate. The commercial people were saying they want to say this, because there's an unmet need here, we want to say this. And then the regulatory team were looking at it and saying, well, perhaps if you worded it like this, we could get that through. So it really is a combination. And of course, then the HOR and the medical team are saying, but the patient does this and the patient does that. So it is a combination of everything coming together, knowing what that patient looks like. And then even then with the payers, well, if we don't have a certain endpoint, the payers won't pay for that.
And that's where the orchestration is really important, whether that's the clinical development lead who does that, whether it's the medical affairs lead who does that. I've seen and I've been part of organizations where that is the same person, and these are in smaller organizations where clinical development and medical affairs are in the same group. So it's not the same person. It's like two people within a small team. So to your point, exactly, it's making sure that there is this coordination of messaging for all of the aspects that are important, because it's not just about hitting all the endpoints on the phase 3 trial. That's certainly important and paramount for success of launch. But those endpoints have to matter in the real clinical world. They have to matter to patients. They have to matter to clinicians. And unfortunately, they have to, I say unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, they have to matter within the payer sector as well. Because if the payers don't care, then it can be the best study since, in the history of medicine. But if no one pays for it, then how is it actually going to make it to patients? So, all of those aspects need to be incredibly coordinated.
Yeah, and perhaps in some companies, the supply chain people get involved with the clinical team. But of course,
absolutely.
There can be sometimes supply chain challenges that need to be addressed up front before you get into the launch, because there may be some things that, again, the team will need to know. For example, if the product needs to be refrigerated at a particular temperature, do the potential users, customers, the HCPs have those facilities? Because otherwise, when it launches, they can't use it. So there's a number of people that all have to get involved relatively early on, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen, some challenges there as well, where, some key product was used for a different therapy that was needed for the drug that was being studied. So, well, now we have to wait 6 months because we have to make more batch, get it quality approved and all of that. So it's like, okay, so now we have to tell everyone, okay, it's going to be longer than anticipated. And here's why, right? No fault of our own. That's just, to your point about supply chain issues. I think the refrigeration one, temperature control, is a great one as well. And we've learned that a lot, from the COVID vaccine experience that many organizations have had recently. And those are important for the end user, right? The HCPs who are going to use these therapies. If they don't store it appropriately, then how effective is the therapy going to be, right? So all of these are certainly factors, that's why I call it the careful orchestration.
Yeah, and we're glad that you're in that careful orchestration. Let's think about, you've talked about the pandemic and that, but let's think about the last 18 months. What trends have you seen in the industry over the last 18 months, 2 years? 2 years now, really, isn't it?
For me, it's been fascinating to see more development in the rare disease area. There are these devastating neurological conditions affecting both adults and children. Certainly more emphasis on cancer therapies, especially using very targeted, innovative therapies, immunotherapies in lieu of, very broad and toxic chemotherapeutic agents. There are certainly, pandemic driven or not, although it was happening before the pandemic, was using virtual platforms in different ways. Medical education was always a great way. I was a user of virtual platforms for my continuing medical education for years. So that exploded, obviously. And over the past couple of years, even having conferences on virtual platforms, both live and recorded, was certainly helpful. And if for no other reason, it was able to coalesce and capture and sort of like harbor all of the key information in one place without having feel like when we've gone to conferences live and in person in the past, that I'd have to choose between one of three sessions because they were all going on simultaneously. I'm like, okay, I can't make it here and I can't make it there because this one is really, really interesting and important to me right now. But now I have the opportunity to see those sort of, in recorded fashion. And I've been doing that over the past couple of years a lot easier. Another thing is really using artificial intelligence in a variety of different ways, not just for diagnosis of disease or for like radiological conditions. I have some colleagues in radiology who use like really cool AI technology to help them diagnose disease, but even using AI when it comes to identifying key opinion leaders, who are the treaters, where are the centers of excellence for a specific condition, where are these experts all over the country and the world, and trying to use those AI data elements to identify them a lot easier than saying, okay, who was on the podium speaking about X topic on this day, right? Just trying to use as much real world evidence as possible to get the best people so that our medical teams can engage with them. And something that's happened relatively recently, again, I don't know whether it's been pandemic driven or not, but I've seen a lot of it before, was the use of direct to consumer disease area awareness, education, commercials to talk about a condition without talking about a specific therapy. Although if you saw who made the commercial, you could probably put two and two together with a little bit of homework, right? So you didn't know what the company was developing, except that you knew that the company was developing something in that therapeutic area, right? And we've seen different ones, so I won't name disease conditions specifically, but, next time you watch television, just keep track of they're talking about a disease, but they're not talking about a remedy for the disease, but then just follow the company and then you'll be able to see what they're studying in that disease state. And lastly, I think there's been, and I think it's been long overdue, and a few companies have done this a lot better than the majority of companies, is really having an outward expression of appreciation to the patients who participate in their clinical trials. There's no question that the only way we in industry are successful and can get products out into the market is if patients participate in our clinical trials. And that's a multi-layered orchestration in and of itself to identify patients, to talk to them about the mission of the study, the risks and the benefits. And not too many companies do this. 3 or 4 explicitly do it in every commercial that I've seen about their product or their studies, where they actively thank the patients for their participation. I hope other organizations pick up on that because I've been seeing that more and more. And I think that's a great way to show our appreciation to them. We wouldn't be able to get a product out for launch without patients in the studies.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, and I used to work for ParExcel, an arm of ParExcel, who big contract research organization. And we often got involved with some of the studies because as we were working with our companies, they were trying to get hold of patients. And it's always a difficult task, like you say, especially if there are a number of studies going on at the same time. If there are a number of products coming out in a similar area, you can end up fighting for patients, but it's also about making sure you get the right patient, the right inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, so that you get the right patient for what your product actually does. And that can sometimes be difficult. And like you say, to actually thank those patients for being part of those trials. And hopefully along the way, the patients have benefited enormously from doing those trials.
I would hope so. I think it's really important. It's not been something that's been done often and should happen for all of us. We should all be doing this.
Yeah. When I was I worked in laboratories, I was actually actively involved in phase 1 studies, volunteering, because it was important. I was doing research, and if I then could complement and contribute to research, then that was important for me. Okay, it's an interesting time at the moment, isn't it? The last 18 months have certainly seen a big change, and certainly AI. I was reading a book last night about the AI and how it's changing, even potentially how quickly drugs can come to market because of the modeling that they're doing now and working on. And it would be interesting to see what happens going forward with whether we can, pull these drugs together, pull these products together quicker through the use of AI. But there are a lot of other factors as well. What do you think needs to be done to increase launch success going forward? I'm asking you to open up your crystal ball. What do you think, given what we've just been through, given what we're going through now, what do you think is important to increase launch going forward, success launch?
I certainly think, and I come back to that orchestration and collaboration, regardless of the size of the organization, there should be a period of time ahead of projected launch. For some organizations, it might be 2 to 3 years. For other organizations, it may be a year or a year and a half. Regardless of that period of preparation time while the phase 3 study is going on, that really should be bringing all of the key players from clinical development through medical, through commercialization at the beginning or soon after the phase 3 program. Because one of the things about phase 3 programs, they are not quick studies. Phase 3 programs in different therapeutic areas can be as short as 3 years or as long as 5 years, depending on the therapeutic area. So this can kind of happen simultaneously, even in the middle of the phase 3 study, because if there are either signals or ideas or challenges that occur during the study, certainly the regulatory people can double back with the health authority and say, hey, this is happening. What do you all suggest? The clinical development team could also then take that into account. The medical affairs and commercial teams could reach out to clinicians across the country and the world and essentially say, hey, we're running into this issue. Is this what you see in the real world? Like, what do you really face? We're trying to solve for this problem. Have we designed it in the right way? And if we need to make a change along the way, maybe we could do a protocol amendment to address those issues. Go back to the patients and essentially say, I know that there are many vocal folks out there, but as many as we try to get into the study, we can't. So how can you help us, right? Recruit more patients. One of the great challenges of any clinical study is patient recruitment and retention. But I think the key point for me and for every organization is going to be a little bit different. There is no such thing as starting too early in this coordination process. It doesn't have to be an activity that the entire team meets every day or every week, maybe even not even every month. I mean, depending on the structure and design of the study, there should be common touch points to allow for the broad team to get together on a regular basis to understand and discuss the progress of the study, because all of that is going to provide information for product launch. So I do think it's a matter of orchestrating within the right period of time, knowing that each organization is going to define the right period of time a little bit differently. But certainly one of the challenges that is going to pull everyone's hair out of their head is if you wait less than 12 months to actually start this process. You and I have been in situations where if it's 12 months and we don't have a launch team ready yet, we're not going to have a successful launch, period. So you have to give yourself enough of a runway to do that.
Exactly. I mean, you've mentioned that we usually work with our clients 3 to 5 years prior to launch, and I totally agree with you about the communication, because you can't define a strategy if you don't have all the pieces. If you don't know where you're going, right, you can't define the strategy. And so getting the right people around the table is important to get the input onto that strategy. What does it look like? And it may be that there's an overall strategy and then each team develops from that. But 3 to 5 years before launch, you can really start to see what you need to do and when you need to do that, and start moving and having these discussions for feedback. So, for example, if you start a trial and something comes up, right, well, we've got an advisory board coming up. Let's talk to the specialists and see what they think. Or let's go out to the specialists or even the payers. I think one of the successes I saw was when the team were going to the payers a lot earlier on than they normally would do to have that discussion.
That's right.
So it's who do you need to have the discussion with, both internally and externally, as early as possible, so that everybody knows what's going on and you can gain insights from the market, because they're invaluable. What the clinicians say to you back, what the clinicians are saying to the, if you've got MOLs out there or MSLs, what are they saying out there to bring it back in? And do we need to course correct before we go down a path that could be very unsuccessful? So, yeah, that's awesome. I mean, There's a lot of moving parts to a product launch, aren't there?
And then there's also the moving parts of, upward mobility within the organization, or people moving from one organization to another, or, in some circumstances, reductions in size within an organization, cutbacks, right? So, all of those we haven't even mentioned sort of like those other internal and external factors that may influence product launch, which we both agree that if you start early enough, you might be able to pivot from some of those, and account for them over time.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And the ability, that's one of the reasons why we love being in product launch, because no two launches are the same, because there are so many different factors, so many different people involved, different mechanisms of action, different criteria, different endpoints that are to be reached. But it's such an exciting area. But the sense of achievement you see when the product is launched successfully, but more importantly, when those patients receive it.
That's right.
And just to have one of those things happen. One of the patients I always like to talk about was the patient would get up every morning, his skin would literally slough off. How painful and debilitating is that for a patient? But the product we were helping the company to launch stopped that, so he could have a normal life. And that to me is so important when we can get that product, all of us working together, the medical, the clinical, and, when we partner with companies, it's getting that product to launch so that patient at the end of the day can get exactly what they need.
Absolutely.
You mentioned cancer. My dad's was a 3-time survivor of cancer. So things are very close to most of our hearts. You either know somebody or, when you see those patients either starting to recover or feeling better, that's when the job is really worthwhile, isn't it?
That's right. That's the best part.
So thank you. That's really given us a lot of food for thought. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think we're getting a little repetitive, so that's good. Means we're hitting all the key themes, and there's an importance in repeating those key themes, and I hope that the audience picked up on that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So we've themed what, with yourself, and other experts, what's successful, what's crucial for a successful product launch. And the idea, as I said at the beginning, is to provide podcast participants, even if we have had repetition, it's to stimulate the ideas and thinking that they might potentially be product launchers, and also to stimulate potential innovations, because if we can give one idea that somebody thinks, I never thought about that, then it might be an innovation for the industry as a whole. So to our listeners, we hope you've gained new insights and enjoyed the podcast. Feel free to share your thoughts. And if you have any questions, please contact me with any suggestions or questions at lynn@connectorstrategy.com. And it would be a pleasure to hear from you. Ben, thank you so much for your insights, your sharing, and your expertise. And thank you for being in the industry and doing what you do to help patients improve their lives.
Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity. I look forward to any in the future as well. It's always good speaking with you, Lynn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. There's a lot more great information to come, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned as we continue in this series. If you enjoyed the podcast today, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more information, see our website, www.connectastrategy.com. That's www.connectastrategy.com. Or follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn.